The police were handcuffing 78-year-old Sharon Hayes outside her own home. Her hands were pulled behind her back. Her face was covered with tears. And standing just a few feet away, smiling as if she had finally won, was Karen Whitmore, the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. "This is my house," Sharon cried. But the police officer continued securing the handcuffs. Karen pointed toward the elderly woman. "She has no legal right to be on that property." Then, suddenly, a car screeched into the driveway. "Mom!" Susan Hayes came running toward them. She had received a 30-second phone call from her mother. And in that call, Sharon had said only 4 words. "They're taking me away." Susan stopped when she saw the handcuffs. Her face turned pale. "What are you doing to my mother?" The older police officer looked at her. "We received a complaint regarding unlawful occupation of this property." Susan stared at Karen. "Unlawful occupation?" Karen folded her arms. "Your mother was legally removed from the property this morning." Susan looked at Sharon. "Mom, did you sign anything?" Sharon shook her head. "No." Susan turned back toward Karen. "Then how exactly did she lose her home?" Karen pointed toward a stack of papers on a nearby table. "The property has been legally transferred." Susan stared at her. "To who?" Karen answered calmly. "The Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." For a moment, Susan couldn't speak. Then she looked at her mother. "You took my mother's house?" Karen's expression hardened. "Your mother owed more than $23,000 in fines, late fees, and legal expenses." Susan looked at Sharon. "Mom, did you sign anything?" Sharon shook her head. "No." Susan turned back toward Karen. "Then how exactly did she lose her home?" Karen pointed toward a stack of papers on a nearby table. "The property has been legally transferred." Susan stared at her. "To who?" Karen answered calmly. "The Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." For a moment, Susan couldn't speak. Then she looked at her mother. "You took my mother's house?" Karen's expression hardened. "Your mother owed more than $23,000 in fines, late fees, and legal expenses." Susan looked at Sharon. "What did you supposedly do?" Karen began listing the violations. Unauthorized mailbox replacement, landscaping violations, exterior appearance violations, non-compliant window coverings. Susan stared at her. "You tried to take a 78-year-old woman's house over a mailbox and curtains?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "That is not what happened." "Then show me the paperwork." Karen pointed toward the documents. "Everything is legal." Susan walked to the table and opened the folder she had brought with her. "I brought copies of everything too." She pulled out one document. "Mailbox violation." Another. "Landscaping violation." Another. "Porch violation." Then she looked at her mother. "How long has this been going on?" Sharon lowered her eyes. 3 years. Susan froze. 3 years. Sharon nodded. "I didn't want to bother you." Susan knelt beside her. "Mom, you thought you were going to lose your house." Sharon's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know what else to do." Susan slowly stood up. Then she faced Karen. "You knew she was 78. Karen said nothing. "You knew she lived alone." Still nothing. "And you kept threatening her with foreclosure?" Karen's expression became defensive. "Be careful with your accusations." Susan opened another folder. "No. You should be careful with your paperwork." She placed payment receipts on the table. "My mother paid the fines." Karen immediately shook her head. "Not all of them." Susan placed another receipt down. "Paid." Then another. "Paid." And another. "Paid." Karen's confident expression began to disappear. Susan picked up one final document. This payment was made under protest. The older police officer looked at it. "What does that mean?" Susan answered without taking her eyes off Karen. "It means my mother paid because she was threatened with a lien against her home." Karen immediately protested. "That is not true." Susan pulled out her phone. "I have the voicemail." She pressed play. Karen's own voice came from the phone. "Pay this fine by Friday, or we will take the next legal step against your property." The recording ended. The officer looked at Karen. "Did you make that call?" Karen looked away. "I don't remember." Susan opened the final section of her folder. "Then maybe you remember this." She spread an old property survey across the table. The older police officer leaned over it. Karen stepped closer. Susan pointed at the boundary lines. "This is my mother's property." Then she pointed to another section. "And this is the HOA community." The officer studied the map. Susan's voice became quiet. "The HOA clubhouse is on my mother's land." Karen's face changed. Susan continued. The HOA offices are on her land too. Karen took a step backward. No. Susan pulled out another document. And part of the private road. Karen stared at the survey. The older officer looked at her. Where did you get the documents claiming the HOA owned this property? Karen's face had gone pale. From the county. Which county office? Karen hesitated. I don't remember. The officer looked at the original deed, then at the HOA documents. His expression changed. Mrs. Hayes, do you have the original deed to this property? Sharon nodded slowly. I think so. She and Susan rushed inside. They searched through the old office that had belonged to Sharon's late husband. Finally, Sharon opened the bottom drawer of an old wooden desk. Her hand stopped. Inside was a thick brown envelope. She pulled it out. Susan stared at it. Is that the original deed? Sharon nodded. They returned to the living room. The officer opened the envelope and compared the original deed with the HOA's documents. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked at Karen. Where did you get this document? Karen's face suddenly lost all color. Because the original deed showed something the HOA had never told Sharon. The boundaries were not what Karen had claimed. And if the survey and deed were authentic, the HOA may never have had the legal authority to take Sharon's home in the first place. Susan looked at Karen. But that's not even the worst part. Karen stared at her. Susan pulled out one more document. This explains how the HOA got away with this for so long. Karen looked down, and the moment she saw the name on the document, her entire expression changed. Because the name belonged to the man who had helped create the HOA. Her own husband. Karen Whitmore had entered Sharon Hayes' home believing the elderly woman was about to be arrested. Now, Karen was the one staring at documents that could destroy everything she had built. Susan placed the financial records on the table. My mother paid the HOA for 3 years. The older police officer examined the receipts. Susan pointed to the payment records. But part of that money didn't go into the HOA's regular operating account. Karen immediately stepped forward. That information is confidential. Susan looked at her. Then why did the money go to a private company owned by your husband? Karen froze. The officer looked at her. Your husband owns that company? Karen's voice became weak. It was a consulting company. Susan placed another document on the table. And your husband approved the enforcement actions against my mother. His signature was clearly visible. Karen stared at it. I didn't know. Susan looked at her. You didn't know where the money went. Karen shook her head. You didn't know where the money went. Karen shook her head. I trusted my husband. For the first time, Karen no longer looked like a powerful HOA president. She looked like someone who had just realized she might have been used. But Susan wasn't finished. She pulled a small black USB drive from her folder. Karen stared at it. What is that? Security footage from my mother's house. Susan connected it to her laptop. The video began playing. The footage was from 3 years earlier. A middle-aged man stood outside Sharon's home. It was Karen's husband. Sharon stared at the screen. I remember him. Susan turned up the volume. The man was speaking to Sharon. You don't need to worry about the HOA. Just keep paying the fines and everything will be fine. Then he said something that changed everything. Your property is unusual. The original boundary records were never properly updated. Susan stopped the video. Everyone in the room went silent. Karen stared at the screen. Her husband had known. He had known there was a problem with the property boundaries. And yet, the HOA had continued finding Sharon. The recording continued. If anyone asks, just tell them the HOA has authority. The video ended. Karen's face had gone completely pale. Susan turned toward her. You knew? Karen shook her head. No. Your husband knew. I didn't. But you enforced the rules. I thought they were legal. You threatened my mother. Karen's voice cracked. I was doing my job. Susan looked at her. Your job was not to threaten a 78-year-old woman until she paid money she didn't owe. Karen had no answer. The older police officer looked at the documents. Mrs. Hayes, based on what we've seen, we have no reason to arrest you. Sharon closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her cheek. I never did anything wrong. Susan held her hand. I know. The officer then turned toward Karen. But we may need to speak with you again. Karen's expression changed. Me? Yes. Karen looked toward Sharon. And for the first time, she seemed to understand what she had done. She had not been dealing with a violation number. She had been threatening an elderly woman in her own home. Karen stepped toward Sharon. I didn't know. Sharon looked at her. You knew enough to keep going. Karen's eyes filled with tears. I made mistakes. You tried to take my house. I didn't know the documents were wrong. You sent police to arrest me. Karen's voice broke. I thought the court order was valid. Sharon stared at her. You never checked? Karen had no answer. The older officer stepped toward the door. Mrs. Hayes, you are free to remain in your home. Sharon looked at him. Thank you. Then Karen suddenly began to panic. Sharon. Sharon turned around. Karen's voice became desperate. Please. Susan stepped between them. Please what? Karen looked at Sharon. Please don't destroy my life. Susan stared at her. You were willing to destroy my mother's. Karen began crying. I didn't know. Susan shook her head. You knew enough to keep going. Karen looked at Sharon. Please don't call the county. Sharon stared at her. 20 minutes earlier, Karen had stood in that same home while Sharon was being handcuffed. Now Karen was begging Sharon not to report her. Sharon looked at the documents on the table. 3 years of fines, threatening letters, payment records, financial transfers, security footage, and the documents that could prove the HOA had never had the authority to take her property. Then Sharon looked back at Karen. Call them. Karen's head lifted. Please. Sharon's voice was calm. I spent 3 years afraid of you. Karen said nothing. I paid money I couldn't afford because I was afraid you would take my home. Sharon looked directly at her. Then today, you came into my house with police officers and tried to have me arrested. Karen was crying now. I am sorry. Sharon's expression remained firm. You don't get to ask me for mercy now. Susan made the call, and that call changed everything. Within weeks, county officials began reviewing the HOA's property records. The suspicious financial transfers were investigated. The questionable property transfer was challenged. The HOA president resigned, and the attempt to take Sharon Hayes' home was overturned. Sharon kept her house, the home where she had raised her children, the home where her husband had spent his final years, the home Karen Whitmore had tried to take with a stack of papers and a phone call. Months later, Susan helped her mother replace the old mailbox. This time, Sharon chose the one she actually wanted. Susan finished installing it and stepped back. Sharon smiled. Do you think they'll find me for it? Susan laughed. No. Sharon looked down the street. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of another HOA letter. She wasn't afraid of a knock at the door. She wasn't afraid someone would try to take her home. She was home. And Karen Whitmore had learned a lesson she would never forget. A title does not give someone the right to steal. A position does not make someone powerful. And official-looking papers do not erase the truth. Because sometimes, the person an HOA tries to push out of her own home is the one person who has the documents to bring the entire organization down. And sometimes, the woman who arrives with the police expecting an elderly homeowner to beg for mercy ends up being the one begging instead.